This series is dedicated to Jason, a follower and a member of the J Primecast community. I've already provided my answers to these questions in episode 1, and now it's time to hear from another creator that I admire.
Hi, my name is Newton Lilavois, and I'm the creator of Crescent City Monsters webcomic. Crescent City Monsters is a supernatural tale. I'm Haitian American, and I wanted to combine that mystique of New Orleans supernatural with the rich cultural lore of Haitian voodoo. And at the heart of it, that's what the Crescent City Monsters webcomic is about. Now, we've been reviewed by sites like afropunk.com and bleedingcool.com, and we've gotten some really good reviews. But don't take my word for it. Don't take their word for it. You can go to crescentcitymonsters.com and check it out yourself. I guarantee you'll be blown away by the artwork, and the story will have you hooked. Thanks.
Putting your book on an online platform for people to read for free, is that wise to do, or is it better to do once the book is complete?
So let's handle the second part of the question, first part of the question, which is when to put your book online. Now, I'm a firm believer that you should put your book or parts of the book online as soon as possible. Now, I found that it's beneficial in terms of building a social media platform because people have an idea of what you're doing. They'll see sketches, they'll see characters, and they'll get a sense of, okay, well, this is what he's doing. I like the artwork, and I'm going to follow him either on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. So you should do it as soon as possible, because if you wait until, let's say, you're complete with the book or a good amount of pages, and that takes 6 weeks or 6 months. That 6 weeks or 6 months could have been used to build a following. So I'm a firm believer that you should put either your book or parts of your book online as soon as possible. Now, the other part of the question, why? It builds on what I was saying earlier with the social media following, and not just social media following, but also your email list, which is also important, and in some respects even more important than your social media following. I found that the more pages I put up online for my webcomic, Crescent City Monsters, the more quicker my email list built, because people had a chance to actually read more of the story, and they got excited about it. They kind of enjoy the story, and they want to be part of that journey. And the more content you provide them, the more likely they are to subscribe to your email list. Now, originally when I started, I figured I'd put up 10 pages, and when the 10 pages came up, I realized, like, okay, people like the story, but I realized they still really don't know or understand where the story is going. So I started putting up more pages, and the plan wasn't to put the whole issue up. Right now, I have full chapter 1, but eventually, that's what it came down to, and I decided to do that because it made sense. It's if you're building a following, and you want to be able to give enough content to the users and give them more than just a taste, but have them really connect with the story. Well, in my case, it made sense to actually put the whole chapter 1 on. A lot of people are like, well, how are you going to make money if your people can read it for free? Well, my fans, they love the stuff enough that they're willing to actually pay for the physical comic. And a lot of people ask me, hey, where can I buy that? So those are the true fans that you want. People who come to your website and read your web comic, and they're pretty much over it. That's not that's not really your core fan base. Your core fan base, the way you really have to think about it is, if someone is willing to pay for your story that they've read online, then those are the people that you're looking for, and that's one good reason to actually put your book online. And if you want to segue into when should you charge for it, charge for it when you transition from a web comic to an actual physical comic. Now, currently, Crescent City Monsters is still a webcomic, but in 2-3 weeks we're starting a Kickstarter, and we'll be on our way to actually print a physical comic. And that's the model I'm using. And for me, it kind of makes sense because when you think about it in the real world, right, you can go into a comic book store, you can browse through a comic, or you can actually read the whole comic before you buy it and decide whether or not you choose it, right? So the model that I'm currently following kind of reflects the real world of purchasing a comic, so I kind of like that. And the fact that it's sort of like the proof is in the pudding. If people are actually willing to pay for something that they're reading for free and they want a physical copy of it, then you can be sure that you're headed in the right direction in terms of what you're doing with your story or your webcomic. So it's sort of validation. And so that's my thinking of it. The short answer of when should you charge for it is when you should charge for it when you create a physical copy. Or in my case, what I also plan to do is create a PDF of the webcomic when the Kickstarter starts. And the PDF will have extra content that's not in the webcomic itself. So, and plus PDFs are more convenient. You can download them and access them, on your tablet or your computer.
Flashbacks. What's the best way to illustrate a flashback? Just put it in a different color scheme, maybe grayscale, or is there something that I'm missing that indicates a flashback to let the reader know this is a flashback?
You can either switch drawing styles or have another artist do the flashback. So you could kind of get a sense that, okay, this is some sort of displacement in the story, and you can use a different art style or a different artist as a time displacement for the flashback. That would be interesting to see. I don't think I've ever seen that before, but I guess if done right, it could work.
Storyboard art. I understand what it is. Just, is it important? Do I need to do that, or not so much?
Okay. Yes, they are very important, and yes, they are needed. So I'm going to talk about layouts in respect to when I write out the particular pages, how the artist lays everything out. So usually the process that I've been working with and other artists who have worked with me use is before they even start inking or really drawing, they'll send me a sketch of the layouts of how the page looks, which I find really important because you get a sense of what the artist is going to do before they actually commit themselves. And I find that the layouts are important because sometimes once the artist lays something out, you get a nice visual representation of how the scene is going to look, because it could look one way in your head, and once the artist starts sketching things out, you'll see how things fit, and you might like, what, this is a little too tight, or what, I could add maybe one more panel. So they're very important, they're needed, and I would definitely always use layouts before you commit yourself to the final page.
Writing your story in script form, is it important to write the entire thing out, including dialogue, before you tackle the art? Or do you put the dialogue in as you go, or maybe after all the art is done?
Is writing a story as a script important? Yes, it is. You have to think of a script as the communication tool between you and the artist. Usually, sometimes when I begin my story, I'll actually write it out in prose form. But that's just for me because it helps me get into the story, it helps me get into the mindset. But if I gave that to an artist, and he would have to interpret what I want to do, it would be a disaster. When you write a script, you're taking pieces of what actions that's perceived as moving in your mind, and you're determining, okay, this is what I want in this panel to convey this particular idea at this particular time, which is really important. You have to be able to figure out, the script helps you. The script helps you and the artist communicate that directly and concisely, and it's the best form of that communication. And usually the script really is just you and the artist. Typically, unless you want to show it to the world, only you and your artist the script will ever see the script, right? So it's a communication tool between you and the artist, and it's very important that you write the script in a way that the artist is gonna be able to visualize and write, draw everything that's important to you. So you try to be as try to get as much details as possible, but you also have to have a fine line between writing too much details, which limits the artist in terms of what he wants to do creatively, and writing too little detail where the artist is constantly asking you questions about a particular scene or asking you for reference.
And as far as your characters, do you develop them all before you even begin the book, or do you develop them as you go, or some of them?
Well, this is a really good question. I've used both approaches. Sometimes I've come up with a story idea. I'm like, wow, this is a really great story. And I know who the characters are, right? But it's really the story that really first hit me and kind of excited me in terms of wanting to develop it more. So I'll start with the story first, and then I'll develop the characters as I go along. I'll say, well, what kind of characters should I add to the story? And then from there, I'll add the stories and like the characters to the stories, and ask myself, okay, how does this particular character behave, and how would he behave in this story and given this situation? And then on the flip side, I've started with just a character, like, wow, this is a great character idea, and I have a general sense of the situation. Like, hey, this is gonna be a sci-fi story, taking place in Mars, but there'd be something unique about that character that really drew me in, and I'll build on that, and it just all depends on which way you're coming from the story. I've had to do both. For me, there's no real hard set rule. For me, the ultimate goal really is to make sure that the characters are acting appropriate, for the story. Just make sure you build the characters in a way that fits with the story. But eventually, what I do notice is, no matter which way I start, it is the characters who I end up focusing on, who kind of who kind of drive the story. So I'll start either way. I'll either start with the story first or the character first. But either way, it's always the character that usually ends up ultimately driving the story. Sometimes I've changed a little bit of the story because I feel like it's something that fits the character, as opposed to trying to make sure that the character is forced into a story that just doesn't fit.
Transitioning from one place to another in the story.
I'm a big fan of using the page turns or just the pages themselves as flip going back and forth between locations. That's the primary tool I use for going back and forth between locations. If it's not a page flip, like let's say the pages are right next to each other and you don't necessarily have to turn the page, I might add a caption like, in meanwhile in the forest, which I rarely do that. I'm not sure why. It just feels kind of like old school to me. So I just usually use. Usually it's pretty obvious that there's a scene change, especially since they have to go back and forth between like a page or something. So I use a lot of the page transitions to go back and forth between locations. That's my primary tool.
I've been having difficulty naming my characters as well.
So naming characters, I think, is my weak. Is one of my weak points. For some reason, I don't feel like I'm really good at naming characters. Don't ask me why, but um, I'm not really. I'm not really. I'm not really good at naming characters, so I would probably be the worst person to ask advice on naming characters.
Is there any relevance to the size of a panel?
What I'm gonna answer is not directly a question here, but it's, I guess it can, it's part of it. So instead of size and shape of a panel, number of panels is really important. So when I first started, I realized, okay, I'm writing the script and I have to write, the scenes for every panel. And I realized, okay, I would have to determine how many panels are on the page. So what I did is I looked through the comic books I liked and saw the flow and determined how many panels were per page, and in what situations do you put more panels and in what situations do you put less panels. So I think I took a look at one of my favorite comic series, Walking Dead, and I looked at that and then maybe a couple of others, and so I determined, okay, average number of panels, 5 to 6 panels per page, and it depends. If you have a lot of action, you put less panels as possible, so the action can look dynamic. It depends on the action scenes, but that's the general rule I use. Less panels if the page has a lot of actions. If the page has more dialogue, I'll put a little bit more panels. And then the shape of the panels. What the most important shape for me is really the indication of how wide the panel is. I find that for me, when I'm doing something, that's the most important. Well, actually, you know what too. So I emphasize if I want a wide panel, I'll always tell the artist, make sure this panel is wide, because usually I there's a reason why I want it wide. And then also small panels. Sometimes I want to like a close up, and the close up is like a face or something, and I want but I, even though it's close up, I want it small, to kind of emphasize like, hey, we're focusing on this and this is important. So for shape, I'll do that. And they're important because sometimes you just need to convey certain things, like for example, like I mentioned with the smaller panels, the shape will be smaller because I want it to look like you're focusing on this particular piece. Like in one scene in Crescent City Monsters, the main character is pinky swearing with his little brother, and I kind of like wanted to focus on that. So if I remember correctly, it's a little bit smaller than usual. So I wanted to kind of focus on that. And then with wide panels, sometimes you just want to kind of get a sense of like what's going on. You want to set the mood, so you want to show a little bit of the surroundings and exactly what the character's into, if you want to help set the mood, and as opposed to just focus on the character where you just need to focus on what the character is saying or what the character is doing. So that, for me, that's why the size of the panel and is important. The shape is I'm not sure if you mean irregular shapes like triangles or rectangular, because my artist Gene, sometimes he'll create like panels that are wide, I should say long, up and down the page, as opposed to wide, and it'll be something that he did and that I didn't necessarily write, but I don't mind, because he's really got a good sense of that. So sometimes he'll create a long panel, which is really cool, because he's really experienced in terms of the visuals. So he'll make I've seen him do that a couple of times. A panel will be long as opposed to the regular wide shape, and he does that just to be able to fit, like for example, there in Crescent City Monsters, there's a scene where a particular flying animal transforms into its human form, and to convey that he used a long panel, which worked out great. So he's got a really good eye for that, and as an artist, he's able to kind of determine the best approach to some of the panels that I write out.
How fast do you want to tell your story? How do you decide, I'm going to break this up into a trilogy or a set that's larger, or I'm just going to tell it in one book and be done?
Okay, so I like this question because I'm a fan of the slow burn when you tell a story. I like stories that slowly reveal themselves. I'm a huge fan of that. I don't like to rush into stories. I like slowly revealing things, but it's something that you really have to master, and I think that's the reason I like it, because if you do let's say you're like, all right, I'm a fan of slow burn, I want to slowly reveal my story. You have to walk a fine line between boring somebody to death because you're taking too long to reveal parts of the story, right? So even with a slow burn, there's a rhythm to it, right? It's a slower rhythm, but you have to catch that rhythm that keeps people interested. It's like you're there, you're writing a story, and you're slowly dropping pieces of that would interest the reader while kind of building on the story, because that's it. I guess because it's more, to me, it seems more realistic, because in real life, things are slowly revealed to you. They're never really dramatically just exposed to you, right? And the thing is, when things are revealed too fast to me, it becomes like it seems like a soap opera to me. When things move too quickly, and there's like, wow, so much happened in so little time. It's like you don't have time to process it and really appreciate what's going on. So I'm a big fan of the slow burn. Um, I say, take as many issues as possible. Don't be afraid of trying to slowly reveal things. Don't be afraid that um, you may bore, or the story may be boring. There are ways to not make the stories boring, and usually that's it's not even. It could be a twist in the story. It could be revealing parts of your character that people didn't know about. It could just be exposing, things that people thought. Like, you can say, well, you can build a character one way and then kind of flip it on them. Just things like that to keep it interesting. So um, don't be afraid of the slow burn. That's my advice.
Jason, I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much to Newton Lilavois of Crescent City Monsters for taking the time to provide Jason some insight, and to myself as well. I feel like I learned a lot. You can find Newton's social media and contacts in the description. If you have a question for me, I would love to hear from you, and I mean that literally. Send me an audio file through email. It's justinprime@yahoo.com. Or if you have Anchor, you can easily send me a question through the app. Thank you very much for listening.